rather more vigorous young Tories, if you don't mind my saying so.
I don't mind that. I view myself as a free markets conservative, and I would embrace free trade with the world. So in that respect, I find Europe quite restrictive. But I feel a great sense of commonality with Europe and with European values and culture. My beef's with the EU. I don't share any sort of dislike of European countries or European values. It's this, and it is a bureaucratic beast that we're tethered to.
Just let's be a little bit balanced here. Brussels employs fewer people than Camden or Islington Council.
And then you commute up to Strasbourg once a month, pack up your parliament and move to another town.
It's admittedly that there are some nonsenses in Europe, you know, the curved bananas, etc.
Sure.
But the reality is that Brussels actually relies upon the domestic bureaucracies of member states to implement EU law. It does not actually have a huge enforcement bureaucry itself. So be a little bit careful about the notion.
Get away with ignoring
Precisely.
But I understand that. But that, which I just semi-hyperbolically.
In fact, it's the genius of Europe that it does use direct effect and the use of domestic legal and administrative machinery to implement it, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. We would have a huge Eurostate, a massive Eurostate, but we don't.
I don't think we do. I'm not arguing that we do. But the point I was making about Brussels to Strasbourg is the classic example of something that nobody can justify, nobody can explain, and nobody can change. That's the problem with Europe.
But is there a danger here that our continuing membership of Europe and subordination to the Court of Human Rights means slowly the English common law tradition will be eroded and replaced more by the continental tradition?
Well, by dint of precedents...
You worry about this,
I do. And by dint of the precedents that we accept into our domestic law and follow probably more closely than a lot of other European countries, which, as I say, just take them as indicators or a suggestion of a path of travel, we're doing that, in effect, already. In our common law legal system, we are adopting the precedents that were born of European systems of justice.
I disagree that they're European systems of justice. The Convention is actually an embodiment of common law. In fact, it's not very much different from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted by American lawyers under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt so in 1948. And it's actually an embodiment of common law values. Now, it's true that civil lawyers are interpreting it, predominantly civil lawyers are interpreting it in Strasbourg, in the Strasbourg court. And it's also true that our court, unfortunately, our House of Lords before it became the Supreme Court, has accepted in effect, a common law system of precedent as though it were binding when they're not really binding at all.
It's our own fault.
It's our own fault. It's our own law lords' fault for accepting this, and I would hope that in future we would take the new Supreme Court would take a different view and back away from this slavish following of Strasbourg decisions, because Strasbourg is meant actually to be the lowest common denominator, not the full extent.
Not the
of
apex. It's supposed to be a baseline. I accept that.
The one thing that I found as a real surprise, and I agree with Dominic in this, is I had no idea that half the people on the court at Strasbourg weren't judges. That you got the
appointees.
I mean, I assumed it was just very good judges from around the whole of Europe. I think we could strip out the non-judges out of that.
Unfortunately not. And it's fair to say that the expansion of the Council of Europe into the former Eastern Bloc has, I think, significantly diminished the quality of the Strasbourg position.
Yes, it certainly didn't have a long tradition of judicial independence.
Not a long tradition.
On a final point
judges.
On this, I mean, there is an element of "and another thing" in this book, and running through it also is a complaint that is also linked to our adoption of multiculturalism, and that British values are being undermined in so many ways. And we saw last week the mistake David Cameron made about the schools, which he said were being influenced by his Tahrir. Do you really think that Britain if, say, Cameron wasn't elected and the Labour government carried on for another 20 years, would you expect Britain to be substantially different from it is today in the balance of its society and its law?
Yes, and the reason I say that is that I am all for multiracialism, and I love the combination of different people with different histories particularly in our capital, but in Britain throughout our culture. But I think multiculturalism, the blocking off of separate groups of people into entirely separate ways of life, is unhealthy. And I think to that extent, this is an agenda that we ought to be alive to. And the other thing I'd say, Ken, is that even if you disagree with Dominic Raab's book, it's going to play a key part in if the Tories get into government, this is going to be one of the things they turn to and look to. So it ought to be read.
And Rodney, do you have a fear about where we're going?
Well, I think multiculturalism is a serious problem, and even the head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission has said that multiculturalism is a failure because it creates ghettoization of communities and cultures. I'm not against the absorption of different values into our system. We shouldn't stick with one system of values forever and ever. But I do worry that we begin to see separate communities, and, for example, the argument that we should adopt different laws for different communities strikes me as very dangerous and against the principle of equality under the law and a single system of law for everybody under the rule of law. That strikes me as very dangerous, as undermining those values which I think are or should be fixed values within our legal system.
Absolutely agree.
Well, these, I suspect, are issues that are going to continue to run. I share, I mean, for me it's a fear, the point you were making that this is very much going to be at the heart of a Tory government if we get one. And clearly it will be interesting to see how much of the apparatus that New Labour has created around this issue actually is taken down. I suspect, like you, I suspect much of it will stay.
I'm a cynic, and I expect that the next government will retain almost all of the repressive laws that have been put in force by the last, well, not just the last government, but previous
a last comment there.
Well, I fear that, but I hope for better. I hope that the next Conservative government will give us some more of our liberties back.
Do you know, I've never seen a government elected that didn't disappoint me one time or another. I think we may have to live. You may have to share what many of us on the left have shared over the last few years, which is an acute sense of disappointment. And it's quite interesting how many of the attempts that they made to, like with 42 days, didn't get through the political system. I find that very encouraging. Regrettably, we've come to the end of another epilogue, and I'd like to thank my very eloquent guests, Alex and Rodney. This undoubtedly will run as a debate. If there is a Conservative government, then the issues we've been discussing today are ones that will be discussed around dinner tables and in the pubs up and down the country as the government proceeds with its proposed changes. If you've got an opinion on what we've been talking about today, or if you've got a particular book you'd like to draw to our attention, then please email us at epilogue@presstv.co.uk. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for watching.